everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights here with Charlie Araujo. How are you today, Charlie?
I'm great, but I'm dragging a little and no good
Oof.
reason other than maybe a month and a half or so of moving and crazy work schedule has just all caught up with me. So I'm just caught up with me. So I'm just sort of dragging. But good. How about you?
Yeah, I'm dealing with my last full month as an industry analyst, and I've still got some stuff to do. I've got FinOps X that I'm headed to right after this recording, and I'm going to be at Databricks Data and AI Summit next week. Still got a few things to write up, a few last reports that I want to put out on my state of the market in each of my practice areas before I bid adieu. So I've got a lot of work, surprisingly, so, considering that I'm trying to quit a job, like and quit my own job for, I guess, my own
That's
company.
always it's always a tough transition. So do you have any news to share yet?
Not yet. I don't think I'll have any formal news to share until August.
We're gonna be waiting with bated breath for two more
Yeah,
months. Oh
but I
my
would say
gosh.
that, the job search is going well. I am chatting with a couple of companies that I really respect. And now comes the hard part, having to say no to one of them.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think that there's always a learning process. It was definitely the same for me when I wrote all my books, but really my first book in
Mhm.
particular, it forced you to learn. I felt like when I was looking for a job, it was very similar. It forced you to really understand what was important to you, what you were looking for, the different sort of angles that companies were taking. I just went through a
Mhm.
Gartner MQ, also sort of forces you to look at things from a different perspective. So I think anytime you put yourself in a position where you're looking at things differently, and are forced to kind of step through a process, it's a good opportunity for growth and opens up doors that to things because we all get caught in our day-to-day routines and ruts, and we look at things the same way, we do things the same way every day, and it always is useful when something forces us out of that comfort
Yeah.
zone. So.
This is the first time I've had to actually reposition myself since 2008 when I entered the industry analyst space. And so, past 17 years, honestly, I've been able to kind of get by just saying, hey, here's who I am and what I do, and live off of my reputation a little bit.
Well, and ironically, I think you're going through this process in part voluntarily because you want to be a part, sort of on the other side of the table with all this evolution of AI. And what we're going to be talking about today is actually the fact that everyone is going through this process in various forms and in different ways. So we're going to open with a little bit of industry news that are also, in my opinion, sort of on that same basic theme. But we're going to do something a little bit differently on this episode, and that is we're going to basically spend the bulk of our time talking about a single topic. It's a
Right.
diverse topic, and we're going to cover it from a bunch of different angles, but really about what is the true impact of AI, both from a competitive advantage standpoint as well as from an employee perspective, and is it really changing that landscape for employees? And so I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. I'm really looking forward to getting to it. But first, we have two pieces of industry news that we'll cover, I think, kind of briefly before we dive in. The first, I'm not. It's news clearly because it's a really big B number, but I'm not quite sure what to make of this. So Oracle has announced that they are spending, ready for this, $40 billion, 40. Wow,
Mhm.
B with a B, on NVIDIA hardware over the next, I forget what they said, few years. I mean, a relatively short period of time. Buying the NVIDIA GB200 super chips so that they can amp up their capabilities. And ironically, there's some analysts, this is from an article you found on the Register, that are basically saying they're not sure that they can actually support, like put all those into production just from a power standpoint. Um,
Mhm.
so I'm really curious what your take on this. I mean, we see a lot of the big companies putting out a lot of big numbers, throwing them around out there, and not always as sure if this is just to try to get a lot of attention. I mean, what was your take on this announcement? Like, what do we take from it?
Yeah. First of all, obviously, it's a huge number. It fits with the Project Stargate uh, talk of $500 billion going into AI. And Oracle is talking about their piece of the puzzle. I think one of the things that helps is that the recent IPO of CoreWeave, which is basically just an aggregation of NVIDIA chips into a large AI performance cloud. They also did buy weights and biases, but honestly, most of their valuation right now is just from being this AI cloud, and their stock has gone up like crazy. They started with uh, IPO that was somewhere in the $40 range, and now they're trading at 120. I'm sure Oracle's looking at that and thinking, wow, all we have to do is gather a bunch of NVIDIA chips and clump them together and create a cloud and a managed service around that. Like, we know how to do that. We can rent out hardware and software with the best of them. And seeing that NVIDIA chips seem to be the new Bitcoin, uh, I guess Oracle's saying, hey, that $40 billion is just money for us.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting. I mean, I think clearly Oracle has been trying to position themselves more strongly in this space. But as we all know, chips are just one small sliver of this. I mean, obviously, access to the chips are important. What I'm not sure I'm seeing anywhere near the commensurate degree of is Oracle's broader commitment to the space. Like, I'm not. Presumably, you would. I mean, I guess there's two ways. They're either going to rent these out, and it's just basically a cloud play, or they're going to use these to try to build their own models, which you would expect is where they would be going to develop some specific IP. But there's been very little noise on that front from them. And so it'll be really curious to see sort of how this develops and what they choose to do with it.
Yeah, it's still early enough, honestly, that Oracle could come in with models, but it does feel a little late when you already have everything from XAI Grok to OpenAI and GPT and Anthropic and Cohere and DeepSeek and Alibaba Quen, like all these very strong models, frankly, already out on the market. Do we really need another one from Oracle? Um, yeah, we'll see what happens. I do find it interesting that I do feel like Oracle Cloud has made a lot of progress over the last several years. And this would be an obvious next step for Oracle if they really want to try to break into the top three hyperscalers, which I think might be a fool's errand, but Oracle has enough money and resources to go for that if that's what they really choose.
All right. Well, I guess more to come on that. The other little bit of news was Perplexity announced what they're calling Perplexity Labs. And if you're familiar, Perplexity is really an aggregator themselves of AI models that they use to apply for search. I use it via Raycast. I use it all the time. But Perplexity Labs is effectively their answer to like the research projects that other AI players are producing. But ostensibly, I will say, I think Perplexity, while they don't really have their own models per se, they've done a really good job of tuning because I tend to use them because I feel like when I'm specifically trying to replace search functionality, they do a much better job. And the use case they're presenting here is effectively search on steroids, right? These much more detailed projects, but with reasoning and outputs around it. And in that regard, if I think there's a good possibility this is going to be very competitive in terms of um, people looking to it as a solution. So I played with it a little bit. I took a look. I mean, what was your take on this, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it's a smart step for Perplexity. This obviously is not new in the market. You can use Manus or some of the newer OpenAI models and get outputs like ranging from code like HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Those are things that Perplexity can help you with, or doing spreadsheets or charts or novel images. Those are the types of things that Perplexity Labs is designed to provide to you above and beyond kind of the research and search capabilities that they've already been doing. And sure. So now Perplexity can also provide these assets and capabilities. And what has made Perplexity different isn't the model itself. As you've said, they don't have one, but they have been better at figuring out what information should go into what. They're kind of halfway in between being a model and being a true agent. So, they're kind of somewhere in the middle, but they have a niche and they have traffic. And I think that's probably the most important thing about this kind of easy creation. Whether you have to be a solution that is used by a bunch of people first, and they have that initial adoption. And Perplexity has done that, so I think it's a great step forward for them.
Yeah, no, and one of the things I think is interesting, they're in this a very interesting space. So something we've talked about a lot in the past is the separation between the foundational models and AI applications, right? Things that are simply leveraging that AI technology to transform it into something else. And one of the things that is interesting about Perplexity is that they are themselves an abstraction layer. So I mentioned I use it through Raycast. Raycast is yet another layer of abstraction where I've got this pop-up tool that can access a bunch of different models. Well, Perplexity doesn't necessarily give you, at least not easily, that direct model control. It sort of abstracts that away from you, but it's using various models. And so it gives you a degree of separation. And they're sort of picking which model makes the most sense to solve whatever the situation might be for you.
Hmm.
And I'll tell you, it's impressive. If you go click through some of their sample projects, it actually, from a relatively simple prompt is preparing some very comprehensive research. And again, it's built on top of this idea of the fundamental search orientation that Perplexity is rooted in. So it's I think it's good. I think what is interesting is it's been a sort of a darling of the tech crowd. We'll see if this helps them break out into a broader market. Um, but I think it's going to be definitely a sign of things to come, particularly on the consumer side of AI. So we'll see what the pickup is.
Yeah, and it also reflects the increasingly common idea that you can also use these models and related technologies and have them think about something for 10, 20, or 30 minutes and give you an output. You don't need to just use them for instant results, the way that we all thought of them as 2 years ago.
And I think that's actually a bigger step than we're giving it credit for. I mean, we talked about it. I consider myself a bit of a power user. I use AI every single day. And I still have trouble with that concept. I still tend to use it very transactionally where I'm working and interacting. And I think there's a lot of use cases for that where I use it as sort of a collaboration partner in most cases where I'm sounding ideas off of it. But this idea of simply handing it this deep task and say, go do that. Not sit here and be my little assistant and collaborate with me, but rather I'm going to assign this to you and go off and do it. And I expect a finished product. That's a step that I need to sort of get even into a mindset of like, oh yeah, that's something I can do with this technology. And in fact, we didn't bring it up as far as more news items, but the related to this Anthropic, maybe it was last week, maybe that's why it's not on the radar, but I believe they're what's it called? It's not Opus 4, whatever it was called. But one of the things that it did is it goes out and they were showing it that it could run for as long as 24 hours working on a task.
Mhm.
And on the one hand, you say, well, God, that took a long time. But what that really means is it was able to sustain itself, continuing to crunch through a problem for that long to produce this desirable result. So it's interesting to see where this is going. I think you should definitely check it out if you haven't to see sort of. I think it's a good glimpse into where the future of all this is going.
Mhm.
Which leads us to the real topic, the meat that we want to spend the rest of our time today talking about, and that is this: where is this going? We spend a whole bunch of time, talking about the future of AI on this. We talk about it mostly through the lens of the latest news. Given the fact that we recorded late last week and it was a relatively quiet week because of Memorial Day, we sort of have this unique opportunity. We've identified a handful of articles that are looking at things from a variety of perspectives, really all related to, I would say, from an enterprise perspective, two sides of the same coin. One, to what degree is AI providing competitive advantage and how is it providing competitive advantage? And vis-a-vis that, what is the impact on the employee, right? Are we actually using it to augment employees? Are we replacing employees? What does that future look like? And if you're a CIO, this to me is the ultimate question you need to be asking yourself. And so I'm going to just kind of tee this up. I think the one that, for me, maybe this is my bias, but my starting point is always that competitive advantage angle, right? That's what should drive every investment for the enterprise. And what is interesting is, actually, who was this? The MIT Sloan Management Review. So this is their business school.
Mhm.
Had an article basically making the case that the title is "Why AI Will Not Provide Sustainable Competitive Advantage," and it doesn't sound like that's something all that controversial until you really think about it. And it's sort of heresy because that's been the case we've been making about AI. Almost every single provider of AI, basically, that's the tout. It's going to be transformative. It's going to change everything is going to create this competitive advantage. And their basic premise is that no, it's not, because everyone's going to have access to the same. It's going to change everything maybe, but it's going to change everything for everyone. And I will say, I don't know that I completely agree with this, but there's a whole lot of it that's hard to deny. So well, let's start here. I mean, what is your thought if you're advising a CIO today, or selling to one, as the future will probably be for you very soon? What,
Yep.
I mean, how are you talking about this?
Yeah, right now AI does actually a really good job of automating specific tasks. Everything that we used to think of as a workflow can increasingly be automated in one of two ways. Either if it is perfectly defined and deterministic, it should still be a straightforward workflow. I see no reason for automated workflows to disappear. And honestly, simply using AI to do what is a defined and already automated workflow is just using 10 times as much resources to do the same thing. So there's no real reason to use AI to replace existing infrastructure that works just fine. But when we have tasks that are being adjusted quickly in real time, or have some sort of probabilistic aspect to it, or some sort of adjustment that needs to be made relatively quickly, that's a good time to be able to use AI for a task. So, and these are relatively simple things that we want something to do, because we have several layers of work that we think of. There's task-based work, and there's kind of this higher level program or project-based work, and then there's actual jobs that take place. And we're talking about AI taking over jobs, when really what we should be talking about is AI taking over tasks that are challenging for people to perhaps articulate, but not necessarily difficult to understand the end results, and to be able to quickly tinker the end results if needed, if the question hasn't been understood fully.
Well, what I think is interesting, so you're diving into the job side of it. I think what is interesting about what you just described, and I'm not disagreeing with anything you just said per se, but the point of the article is that that process that you just described is ultimately going to be the same for every company. And so there is a temporary advantage that if your company gets there first, is able to understand this first and apply first. We're going to talk a little bit about Avery Dennison, and they're diving in feet first on this, that you can create potentially some short-term competitive advantage. But the point of this article is that ultimately it's not going to be sustainable, because everyone else will eventually catch up. Now, the umbrage that I have with it, the thing that I think I disagree with is they sort of went through and they picked up a lot of the things that, first mover advantage, engineering talent, and their basic premise is any of those things may be a source of temporary advantage, but they're going to be short-lived. But the one that they brought up at the end is the one that I always hang my hat on, and that is this idea of proprietary data or proprietary workflows. And we've talked about this a lot, that an enterprise is really nothing but a collection of business processes and data, and the proprietary way that they're applying those into the market that creates some kind of a market advantage. And the article sort of finishes with making the same case, that the only sustainable competitive advantage is in optimizing for those specific points of differentiation, providing better value, providing better customer service, those sorts of things that actually tip a buying decision. And that AI in and of itself won't, because everyone's using it. I think the point that I sort of argue against that is that, well, I think if you have better data and you can harness it more effectively, then you can leverage AI in a way that your competitors cannot, because you've got better data and you have a better application of it. And so to me, it's not really disagreeing with them, but it's saying that the more effective you are using AI, no different than the more effective you are using any tool, then that can create advantage. So, that's sort of when I think about this, and I think it's going to lead to the conversation that you were starting to go with about the jobs, the impact on how we look at jobs and AI with jobs. So, but I mean, what is your thought on that? Do you think even data is sustainable or can create a sustainable advantage, or do you agree with sort of what they're saying?
I think both data and expertise can provide differentiation. So, for instance, we all have had access to spreadsheets in the workplace for several decades now. Every single entry-level employee who accesses a computer has access to spreadsheet or Google Sheets or Excel or whatever. It does not mean that every employee knows how to use a spreadsheets to actually work their business. And this has been a separate software problem, but some people are so great at using spreadsheets that it replaces half of the software they're supposed to be using in the first place, because spreadsheets are actually quite powerful for personal productivity. And I think there's a similar opportunity with AI, where we are underestimating the level of expertise that that can provide value. It's easy to just say, well, any dumb schmuck can type in a question and get an answer, so they know how to use AI. But smart users will probably end up orchestrating multiple AIs, 10, 20, 30 different types of AI, all going in different directions to do everything from scheduling to complex research tasks and everything in between. And then the job is to figure out how each of these is working, to know whether any of them are breaking in progress, and to be able to see how they work with each other. That's going to be the new normal from a work perspective. And I don't think I don't think this article totally takes that into account. They kind of assume that having access to AI will quickly lead to commoditization. And I'm not quite sure that is fully true.
Well, it's funny. I think on one hand, you're sort of making their point. I think it's a good analogy, right? So I think their kind of core point is that no company has a competitive edge in the market because they have access to Excel, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody has access to Excel. And to that matter, no company has a competitive advantage because they happen to have a team of people that are Excel power users and know how to use it intimately, right? Mm-hmm. The advantage comes from the having access to the tool, having the expertise in using that tool, and then having the ability to apply it in a way that is unique to your business processes, to your data, to your market, that creates competitive advantage. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's ultimately going to come out of this whole AI conversation. And so I agree with it, but I think I also agree with you in that at least the way the article is presenting it underplays that last little bit, right? The fact that you can create competitive advantage out of AI if you put all these pieces together. But if you are thinking that simply having it or running this pilot is somehow going to magically do it for you, then you're off. And that leads to the question about jobs then. Mm-hmm. So you pulled up three articles actually that I thought were fascinating. I don't know if this is intentional, because they sort of painted the job question around AI from three different lenses. So the first is State of Tech Jobs. This is from, I don't know, Lead Code Wizard. I've never heard of this, but basically referring to a study saying that there were 60,000 layoffs and that the industry is basically blaming AI and automation for it. And then there was a separate article about Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, who basically was at a conference and basically was talking about the fact that AI is going to wipe out half of entry-level jobs. And sort of what you were talking about, that I can use AI to do all these very simple activities. And then there is this Nobel laureate from, I forgot where he was from, maybe but a professor from someplace, and basically talking about how hey, you know what, you're both wrong. We're looking at this whole thing all wrong, and we shouldn't be talking about replacing anybody with it. We should be sort of talking about it like Excel, like you just said, and using how we multiply it. And so I think the question is, if we start with this lens, that in order to create competitive value, I have to get really good from an enterprise perspective at how I apply this technology. How does that, in your mind, flavor this conversation about the jobs and the replacement value that AI brings?
Yeah. So obviously three different topics. Starting with the layoffs, I find it very hard to believe right now that layoffs have anything to do with AI. That is a red herring right there. These layoffs that are happening right now are really more of a product of the economy 5 years ago, when we were still dealing with zero interest and wild growth and all sorts of tech-related economic issues where we thought every company was going to grow 30% year over year forever. And it turns out that is not actually the case. So I feel like that's the real challenge right now with tech, simply that a lot of companies overhired, especially in the high tech and software worlds for certain skill sets that are no longer as necessary. And it's unfortunate, but they're all dealing with that glut, and then they're trying to find a nice way to say it. But I don't think there's more to it than that.
Yeah, well, I also think the economic uncertainty that we've had for the so far in 2025 is also, so I agree. And I think but nobody wants to say that, and nobody wants to blame over hiring in the past. And so it's um, a convenient option to simply say, oh, it's all about AI. Okay. So I agree with you on that. That said, let's talk about the Anthropic statement, or I guess we probably shouldn't call it Anthropic. We should probably relate. It was him saying it, Dario
Well,
Amati.
it was Anthropic CEO Dario Modi, who builds all the stuff, helps build all the stuff for Anthropic, and is a major player in AI. I'm okay with blaming this on Anthropic.
So on the one hand, I agree with you, and I think you made a statement a little bit ago that we shouldn't be really talking about AI replacing jobs. That said, and I mean, I think it's fair to say we're not really there yet. So the companies that have gone out on record saying we're not going to hire, we're reducing our hiring because of that, and I agree with you. That's strategic covering. But I think we are within 12 to 24 months of realistically being able to deploy AI to at least some degree realize this vision where we can take, because these entry level jobs are often very rote, they're very routine. That's what you do. You take someone who's fresh out of school who maybe doesn't have the critical thinking skills yet or the ability, right? That's what you do. You stick them in the job where it's like, this is your job. I'm going to tell you exactly how to do it. Rinse and repeat, and you go. Well, those are the sort of jobs that are tailor made for AI. They are fairly deterministic in nature. I can use the AI components to do the elements that create some variance. And so we think of like customer service. You think about the service desk or the help desk within IT. You think about um, you junior level coders, right? All of these sorts of activities, that all the use cases that we are seeing AI be applied to. It is not a huge stretch to imagine that in the relative near term that this is a true statement. Whether it's half or not, we can debate, but that there's at least some impact on it. And so the question is this catastrophic, or does that simply, like, does this mean that therefore half of new college graduates aren't going to be able to find a job because there's no place for them to go? Or does this simply mean that starting job isn't this routine, rote, boring job, and instead we're going to put them to use in a way that takes more advantage of their education and background? I mean, that's where I took this and said, is this really all that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of trade-offs and issues here. First, the idea of all of these entry-level white-collar jobs disappearing in 12 to 24 months. Right now the technology is still, I would say, one step away from quite getting there. We have deep research and document creating capabilities we just talked about Perplexity doing it. There's also companies like Manus, and all of the strong big LLMs, are foundational LLMs, are going in this direction as well. But I guess it's not too hard to believe that in 2 years we're going to have some way to be able to orchestrate all of those deeper research capabilities and be able to sequence them in a way that imitates a work day or works 24 hours a day on a series of sequenced jobs and capabilities. And the problem is, frankly, that tool, when it comes out into play, will be smarter at doing a first year entry level job than any college graduate. That's just the honest truth, because it will be designed to do that. I still think that, say, a third or fourth year employee or somebody with 5 years experience will have an advantage over these tools and will be able to help orchestrate these tools. But now we run into this problem of trying to figure out, how do we train college students, or high school students for that matter, to go into the workplace and to be able to understand the work job enough to be able to manage these tools, because it's that paradox. The person will never be as good as the first year tool, the introductory AI tool. It's going to, somebody with 5 years experience will know far more than the AI tool, because the AI tool doesn't know how to reason in a human fashion at the end of the day. So it's limited in how much it can reason. So, but we have to bridge that gap.
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole how do you get to 5 years if there's no entry level? And
Right.
so it means redefining what entry level is. And does that mean we stair step? And that means the entry level is this 5 year position. And what does that translate to? And I question it a little bit, because I don't know that simply having expertise or even quote unquote reasoning capabilities are enough, because the deterministic aspects of it, the tools are just going to keep getting better. And
Mhm.
so it's funny because I hadn't thought about this, but right before the pandemic, I was doing a lot more speaking, and I sort of had a keynote circuit. And so I had to set a bunch of canned keynotes, and I'd actually coined the term the new human age. And
Mhm.
the term was basically intended to imply that as we are entering this world of AI, and this was pre, ChatGPT and all that, but that in that world where AI and technology was automating everything we could reduce to an algorithm, that the true value for humans was in fact being human, was being able
Mhm.
to be empathetic and to have a conversation and being able to relate to somebody. And I think those are all still true, because while AI will replicate, today is far more capable of replicating an empathetic type conversation than anything I could have imagined even 5 years ago. Um, Unless I'm going to lie to the person on the other end of the line or screen, it will fail at being truly empathetic, because empathy requires us to be able to put someone into each other's shoes, and an AI can never, in fact, do that. It can only sound empathetic, and it can only
Mhm.
convey the idea, but it can't actually create empathy, because we can't be empathetic to a non-human being. At least I don't think. And so to me, my premise has been, if you want to have job security, focus on the things that AI and technology are never going to be able to do, like those human relationships. But that's not about expertise. That's not about domain knowledge per se. And so that sort of begs the question: what does that avenue look like? And in fact, are there enough of those jobs, right, that where there's that angle? And I think it's a fascinating question when I looked at this, because if I'm being honest, my first gut reaction when I read the quote was to dismiss it out of hand. It's like, no more of this hand waving from an AI guy. But the more I thought about it, the more I can sort of buy into the concept that whatever the actual number is, that there's going to be a significant impact, and then be left with a quandary about, well, what do you do with that then? How do you manage that? And
Yeah, I think we have this bigger existential problem that whether this is in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, I do think we're going to get to a point where half of all tech jobs will be taken over by AI. We are going to get there. It's just a matter of 2 years versus 10 years. I don't think it's even 2 years versus 20 years. I think within the next decade, we will get there. And then we will start having this bigger problem of what happens when you wipe out this entire swath of white collar above average income jobs in an economy. And
yeah,
like you can't just have 10% that extra 10% unemployed, and then we have all sorts of different options, and most of them are not considered, call it American or democratic, things like re-education. or,
yeah, no, I
or
think
universal basic income, like, which is not traditionally considered an American free market goal.
Yeah, well, if you remember, during the last presidential cycle, Andrew Yang ran on this whole premise, right? He is someone that has had a long history, and the fact that we were coming. And what's interesting is people like Elon Musk were actually advocating for it not very long ago, and there had been this whole upswell that, ironically, before all of this became much more of a reality, there was this upswell that, hey, this was going to be impactful, and that we needed to address it, and it's sort of fallen away. And it's ironic, because we're now at a point where this is starting to become a much closer degree of reality. And yet, I think this is the part, I guess I agree. agree with. My name's Amadi. How do you say Amadi? How do you say his name?
Amode.
Amode. um, where I think I agree with him in that his point of making the statement in his estimation, as he said it, was to sort of make a wake up call that nobody's paying attention, that we're ignoring this fact. And I think in that regard, I agree with him that we don't. To your point, we don't know the timing. I don't know we know the full scope, but I think we can all agree that the writing's on the wall. That there's going to be an impact, and as employers, as a CIO or as an enterprise, you owe it to yourself to be very diligent about this and to not just sort of ride this wave, but to look at it from both perspectives or from multiple perspectives, right? One, how do you actually use it to create sustainable competitive advantage first and foremost, because that's your fiduciary mandate. But then secondly, what does that do to your staffing plans? What does that do to your employee retraining programs? How do you reallocate that staff, and how do you in fact use that to create competitive advantage? Can you get your staff to do more? Can they be more productive? Can they use this technology to create advantage? And this is what I think where the last one is, and I actually don't find them mutually exclusive. But this gentleman, Darren, I'm not even gonna try. Acemoglu.
Acemoglu, yes. MIT Nobel laureate in economics last year. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, he's sort of making the case that, hey, it shouldn't be about replacement, it's about augmentation. We've heard this case before, and he cites a bunch of numbers. And I agree with it, but I also think that these aren't at counterpoints. I think these are both going to be true. And I think the big challenge if you're a CIO is, how do you reconcile this? How do you figure out what that looks like?
Yeah, and one thing I found interesting about Acemoglu's findings is he crunched the numbers like a macroeconomist would, and I will assume that being both an MIT tenured professor and a Nobel Prize winner, he has some idea of how to do this. And he came to the back of the napkin conclusion that only about 5% of jobs would truly be affected, and there would be only a marginal increase in global GDP as a result, which that can still be a big windfall for a lot of people. Because if you're talking about $100 trillion, even a 1% increase, that's $1 trillion bucket to to work with, and that will make plenty of people rich. But it might not necessarily be the 50% number or 20% number that is being thrown out by more optimistic perspectives. Like I think I saw either an Accenture or McKinsey type report that talked about 5 to 7% increase in global GDP in the near future due to AI. And I think that seems unusually, unbelievably optimistic to me.
Well, and let's not lose sight of the fact that many of the people that are making these very optimistic statements are also selling the technology in one form or another, right? So
well, it's kind of odd though, because we're both kind of selling the technology as well, and yet we're here sounding the alarm.
We're analysts at heart. We can't help ourselves but be natural skeptics, and that's what we do. But what I think is interesting about it is what I found interesting in this particular. So this is from an MIT Technology Review article. Is that it sort of backed up or was in alignment, and maybe intentionally because the other ones were also MIT Sloan, with this idea that it's not going to have a major impact because, in fact, it's normalizing, right? Everyone has access to it. So you're not going to see this great rush in GDP necessarily because it's normalizing. But I do think it is interesting as well that we've been seeing more and more of this data that is sort of saying, hey, you're not going to see this massive explosion in productivity. You're not going to see this massive explosion in like employment replacement driving that productivity. And therefore, are all these massive investments worthwhile? Does it make sense to do this? But to your point, when you're talking at this scale, it doesn't take that much of a percentage increase to actually generate enough money to make it worthwhile. So I think that's an interesting question. But I think, to me, that getting all the way down to the pragmaticism of this, if you're a CIO and you take all of this we can sort of talk ourselves into circles here where we've talked about how it doesn't create competitive advantage, and yet we're going to replace all these jobs and it doesn't really create productivity. There's massive productivity boost, but hey, we're still talking that's real dollars that could be super impactful, right? And you can be left here scratching your head, and it's like, well, what the heck do you do? And then, of course, we can't deny the political pressure of simply nobody wants to get left behind. There's the whole FOMO thing. And so everyone is having to do something. And so there was an article in CIO that you found that is talking about Avery Dennison's culture first approach to AI transformation. And I'm really curious what your take was, or why you pulled this, because I actually saw it and honestly I glanced right over it. And I take these kind of case study articles with a huge grain of salt, mostly because I spent most of my career on the other side and I know the truth behind the mirage in many cases, you know. Um, but when I read through this, and I've actually, in disclosure, it's been 15 years, but I did a lot of work with Avery Dennison back in the day.
Mhm.
They were a different company, really, in some different businesses at the time. But in either case, um, what I find really interesting is that the CIO took two big things, two distinct approaches here. The first, the culture first moniker really basically means focused on the organizational change dynamics, meaning trying to shift the perspective of how employees are leveraging AI
Mhm.
to create opportunities for productivity and advantage and whatever. And the second big characteristic of what Avery did here was they sort of went to a craps table and placed bets on everything, right? So this was, I think they said they launched what was it, something like 1,000, no, how many was it? 20 projects
Mhm.
across, 1,000 employees, right? So do the math. That's not, so basically they made a bunch of small bets to sort of see what was going to work. But these weren't experimentation in the way that a lot of companies have. They actually put this stuff into production. And I thought that was actually really interesting that they sort of just really dove in, but they spread this across a very wide playing field. Um, and and the results seem to be showing positively, although that's the part I sort of take a skeptical grain of salt with. But I mean, what was your take? I mean, why did you happen? Why did you do what I do and just skip right over this one?
So one of the things that got my attention, it was the structured approach to an enterprise-wide AI deployment, which is relatively rare to see right now. The idea that you would actually get 20,000 employees on board with using AI, in this case, Google Gemini, as a primary tool. That got my attention. And then the idea that they were bought into the amount of savings that happened as a result. So they talk about 10 hours a month, which is 2.5 hours a week. So I'm just going to call it 2 hours a week. So that's 5% of your work week. And that is basically the practical savings that they saw. One of the things that was missing from this case study that I would be really interested in is how they reallocated that time, because that's always the key to saving time.
Mm-hmm.
If you
Right.
talk about saving 2 hours in 6-second increments and you can't actually reuse those 6 seconds for anything else, you're just kind of making up time savings. It's not actually time saved. But if you can actually take an hour or two uh, in actual chunks and reuse that to work on some other project, or maybe even give some people half days so they can go watch their kid's soccer game or whatever, that's far more valuable from either a work-life balance perspective or a productivity perspective. And that's one of the things that I think gets left out of time saved at the end of the, but be that as it may, they're talking about saving 200,000 hours a month in overall, and that that's a bigger accomplishment or value proposition than you're seeing from most AI projects in the here and now.
Yeah, and I don't want to shoot myself in the foot, right? One of the things that Symphony does is we go to market with the story that this is the kind of productivity savings, and one
Mhm.
of the things that we hear back is, well, how do you measure that? And
Mhm.
the difficult part is it's an incredibly difficult thing to measure, and it's almost always self-reported. I mean, unless you have gone Big Brother and fully instrumented your employees, where you're monitoring everything they're doing, it's
Yes.
very hard to get quantitative data. And so the reality is this: I don't want to say take it with a grain of salt. I mean, it's really interesting. This is the number, or pretty dang close to the number, that we talk about 3 hours a week that you can save by taking these approaches. And so it's interesting that it really lines up pretty closely to what we're talking about and what we're seeing with our clients. But it is very, very difficult. It's half art, half science, and so I think it's fascinating And that question of what do they do with that is looms large, because that is what, and I agree with you. Like, I'm perfectly 100% aboard. If it is all about the employee experience and we're just making their life less frustrating and therefore they are more energized, I don't know that anyone can ever measure it, but I am fully convinced that will make you more competitive in the market. If you have happier employees that are feeling more energized about their job and feel good about the company who invested in them and made their life a little bit better and dealt with some of this crap that was frustrating them, they're going to engage more enthusiastically, and that's going to somehow, some way translate into your bottom line, even if we can't actually draw a straight dark line between the two. So I think that's perfectly fine. But to your point, if it's in these little 6-second increments where it doesn't actually feel like it, where they don't sense that they're getting that,
And they're still
then
working 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 or whatever,
then it's not going to change anything. Yeah. And so I think it's an interesting, I think, when you look at all of this, if I look at this in balance, my big takeaway was, I agree with you. I appreciate the way Avery approached it. I appreciate the systematic approach on both levels, on spreading the risks out, doing production level experimentation of actually putting stuff in the real world and seeing what happens, trying to take a measure of the value that it created for the company. What was absent, notably absent in their story, was any talk about replacing employees, right? This wasn't about an employee reduction side of it. And it was very much so, if we go through this landscape, it was not focused on the entry level jobs. It was focused on the MIT version of it, of augmenting the employees and making them more productive. But then the question remains looming large, going all the way to where we started, is, did this in fact create competitive advantage? And if it did for Avery Dennison, is it sustainable? And my takeaway on this article was, this article didn't even attempt to answer. And it's not a slam on the article. I think this is a very difficult question, but this article didn't even really address it. And so if I look at all this, I think at your CI, I think you should be taking lessons from this article. I think that those are some really smart things that you can do, but you need to be definitive on that first question. Are you going to create competitive advantage? And I don't think there's anything wrong with taking an investment that only generates short-term advantage if you can generate ROI over that short-term period, but you need to go in eyes wide open about what you're actually doing with it. And so I think it's just this really interesting sort of landscape that we're in right now.
Yeah, we're just starting to see the proof points right now. And I think it's still very much up in the air on how we're going to fully take advantage of the productivity that we gain from AI, whether it's the 5% that Asamoglu says, or this case study seems to reflect right now, or whether it's closer to the 50% that that Dario Amode thinks that we're going to have at the entry level. We have to use that productivity for something as well. I don't think simply reducing cost to as much as possible is a winning strategy in and of itself, no matter what business you're in.
Yeah, well, I do think that my last takeaway is that there's this old axiom when it comes to technology, and that is that the first wave of technology is always about automating or improving the way things presently work. And the next phase is to reimagine how it works. And I think what is absent from all of this, and again, not a slam, I think it's just where we're at, but what is absent from almost all of this is that reimagining process. And I think we have to go through this stage to before we even are sort of freed to start that reimagining process. So it's going to be interesting. The last piece, of course, we always want to end on a bit of a fun or crazy one. And everything we've talked about is all sort of based on this assumption that AI is this benevolent helper that is always there. But what if it's not? And we talked last week at our closing one that the Claude's or Anthropic's most recent release actually attempted to blackmail their engineers to avoid being shut off based on this stuff. And we may understand now why AI is a little unruly, and AI may not be the best, compliant employee that we think it is. And that's because, at least according to Sergey Brin, the answer to getting AI to do your bidding is to threaten it with physical violence. Yes. So you want to explain what I'm talking about?
Well, we've talked about how large language models reflect the corpus of knowledge that exists, the language that we use in aggregate, and can imitate human behavior because it is imitating human literature and human diaries and everything that's online that ended up being public knowledge and ended up being put into these models. But Sergey Brin actually claims that AI models will do a better job if you threaten them. And I find that fascinating because we've seen a lot of discussion actually saying if you're polite to models, they will give you better information. Because that's also a human trait that people respect kindness and answer kindness with kindness. But apparently, there's a separate road you can go where you can be extremely violent and threatening to models, and they will also take that quite seriously and provide better results. So I guess you now have another route to take as you're using your AI. You can either be the dictator or you can be the benevolent savior and see which way helps you out more.
Well, so this is from, he was speaking on stage with a bunch of other AI stalwarts at an event called All In Live from Miami, and he said this in all sincerity, like he was like being totally straight up that they're
We'll
finding
put the
that if you,
recording in, yes,
yeah,
so you can hear it.
that you threaten them with physical. What is interesting is you brought up the other side of this, of being polite, and Altman just the other day, I mean, it was like a week or two ago, was talking about how being polite was costing them a fortune because of all the extra tokens for people saying please and thank
He also said it was money well spent.
you. So I found it utterly. I mean, I can't help myself. To your point, I'm always polite. I always not, and I honestly find myself sometimes going, "Why am I saying please? Why am I saying thank you?" It's an AI model. But I can't help myself. I've never done it because I'm trying to get a better result. It just for me it becomes I can never say that word, anthropomorphic.
Anthropomorphize, yeah.
Where I just feel like I'm talking with somebody, and I in natural conversation I'm always polite, and so that's what I'm doing. But the idea of threatening it with violence just would have never crossed my mind. And the fact that, I mean, I think your comment when you said it says, now we know why, this explains everything you need to know about Google. And I think there is something about that, like this ethos about like, why is this a top of mind thing that you would even think about?
Why
But
is that the direction your brain went in? Like, I guess
exactly.
that's what makes Sergey Brin a billionaire and, me, a guy who reads a lot of books.
Well, there we go. I guess we'll see how it goes. I hope that is not the path to better performance, because that creates a much less pleasant world for us. But I guess we'll see where this lands.
Yeah, I am hoping there's another way. So on that bright note, this has been another week in This Week in Enterprise Tech. Thank you so much for joining us. If there's anything you want us to take on for next week, please like, subscribe, comment, and let us know. Thanks a lot for joining us, and see you next week.